Hi, everybody. It's John Fischetti along with Scott Emig, and welcome to episode 22 of We Will Get Through This, Transformative Leadership for Disruptive Times. Scott, it's great to see you. Your background's gorgeous. Newcastle's a really pretty place to live.
Thanks, John. It is. It's a beautiful place. It's actually an interesting picture. My son took this. So he was out with his drone, and it's a beautiful place, and it's nice to have that kind of with me all day.
Yeah, we know the time of year it was taken because the sun's setting a little bit further south than it is now.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, it's really
kind of
beautiful.
miss that weather. Yes.
Scott, we kind of got a tough topic here this week to think about, and I know you and I have just had a little bit off-air conversation, but the execution of George Floyd is confronting, I think, to all of us who would be participating in this podcast. How have you coped with just the reality of how far we haven't come as a society?
You know, I think I've gone through a lot of the stages of, grief when you think about it. Shock and horror and anger, and trying to make sense of things. You're right, confronting is probably the right word. I think, as an American, you and I are both Americans, and we're here in Australia, and we're looking back at the country that we love and looking at it and, worried about the future of the place. And we know it's not a uniquely American situation or uniquely American scenario, but it is hard. It's hard to look at it from this far away.
Yeah, this is Reconciliation Week in Australia with an attempt to overcome the inequities to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And just this week on Tuesday, a young boy who said some rude things to police, but his legs were taken out for him by a white police officer, knocked to the ground, teeth broken, and pretty brutal extra excessive force used against him. Over 400 Aboriginal men have died in prison over the last 30 years, most of them in the cover of darkness, not with a smartphone filming it, and most of those with excessive force of the police or the prison security, and almost ignored, except by those who love those individuals or the indigenous community who raises those issues. And trying to figure out how we could turn this and not to put any light on the terrible tragedy, this notion of privilege, this notion of power, notion of social injustice and inequity that continues to perpetuate. I believe everyone in my circle of really informed people is outraged. The demonstrations make sense, not the violence and the looting, but the demonstrations themselves. But I wonder if we could turn this for our school leaders listening in to what might happen at a school level to really address this rather than just say, oh my goodness, that's terrible. And it's moved us from pandemic, to social crisis, but what we might do about it with our schools to really address these issues and not continue just to sort of sweep them under the rug.
I think that's the big challenge. And I think it like the pandemic, school leaders are in a really unique perspective. They have this incredible vantage and this incredible influence in that as a school leader, you have a staff of caring, well-meaning adults who work with you, who want to change the world, and that's why they're in this. And you have influence over the next generation of teachers and doctors and lawyers and store owners, and just by virtue of creating schools around these notions that building schools around these notions of care and compassion and consideration for others. We've been talking about this message for a while as we talk about the pandemic. But it's almost like now more than ever, we need to double down on the importance of rethinking what we're doing.
Absolutely. The opportunity we have coming out of the pandemic, I've been on with several groups of teachers and leaders this week around the world, one in India yesterday, a couple around the Hunter in New South Wales earlier this week. And they're all really excited about the freedom they've been able to get from being relaxed on how much of the curriculum they actually cover, and seeing opportunity to not lose that so we could go deeper instead of wider. We've had that conversation in a few other episodes here. I think that might be the real opportunity, and school leaders are going to have to seize this to really encourage staff, not just in the sociology class or the history class, but across the school to really look at the notion of privilege, really look at the school rules, If we look at in most of the Western world, the number one group of people that get suspended from school or get the extra harsh punishment are usually black and brown boys. And if we try to take that notion and at heart, certainly in certain occasions, there's been incidents that have created the need for those penalties. But the systemic issues of racism and privilege that go into those rules have really not been addressed. So we think we're fixing the problem by making harsher penalties rather than wondering why. And is there a chance with the time we now have to really explore that a bit further? You know, and you've worked in schools that might have had mediation as a process to work out small issues before they became larger, where we didn't need the deputy principal's attention. We have schools that build a social justice framework, and we teach people how to collaborate and to understand and appreciate. I think we have a little space now to build that in without feeling like we're not going to get to the other side because we're going to miss out things for a test. The real test is, can a police officer not kneel down on someone and 9 minutes later have suffocated them? So I think we can rearrange, and maybe we have a little freedom to do that. Maybe we could even take that forward in a state like California, which has parked its use of the ACT and SAT for at least 5 years. Maybe that means, wait a minute, time out. We could do a little deeper on some things that are really about building better people, not just trying to cram a lot of knowledge in to do well on a test.
I 100% agree. You and I actually had a wonderful conversation with the principal earlier this week. And we talked about how do you as a principal help your staff understand the challenges of the students that you're working with? How do you make their lives real? And I thought his answer was powerful, and that he talked about bringing in the staff to a large meeting and having a large picture of a student up on the wall, and you know, one of the boys in his school, one of the boys in his high school, and talking about, what do we know about this student? What should we know about this student? And getting everybody in the room to really talk about an individual and understanding who we're working with, because you know, this goes back to that notion that if kids really believe there's somebody in the building who cares about their future, that they'll care about their future. You know, and that's we want to create societal change, but you can't create societal change unless you do it individually.
Mm-hmm. It's a great example of this notion of knowing. And if young people feel they belong in the space, how much then their ownership of that changes from being a resistor to an involved citizen in the community. I think it's risky because some schools don't want to confront this issue, and it might be a few weeks or months in some places where schools are back.
Yes.
But in schools all around the world, I think it's going to be imperative that the issues of understanding of power and privilege are part of the formal curriculum. The issue of understanding inequity and how its roots are deep. You know, in the United States, if we ask people, they'd fail this. Most Americans would fail that the original Constitution was agreed upon. A giant compromise was created to allow the Southern states to count slaves as 3/5 human beings for membership in the House of Representatives. It's so ingrained in the institution, it was in the original Constitution. So those inequities aren't just wished away. And the legacy of that show their ugly head when a black boy can't wear a hoodie down the street without being accused, accosted, or murdered. Someone chased from a sort of a work site where a house is being built with the assumption of looting that he didn't do, and accosted by vigilantes. That notion of privilege and confronting it, because the only way forward is through it and with education. Everything else will lead to more dissolution of the social fabric of society and, unfortunately, more violence.
It's exactly right. This other project you and I are working on, we're working on trying to create schools as places of welcoming for children that come from refugee and asylum seeker backgrounds. And we had a wonderful conversation with a woman this morning in Prince George's County, Maryland. And it was powerful in that, you know, she talked to us about the fact that with over 1,000 students in her school, she understood the unique challenges of so many of those students, and she had built an enormous team that took it upon themselves to really get to know their lives, their unique challenges, their backgrounds. I think for me, my takeaway from all this is that, we just have to keep coming back to pushing this notion that as principals and as educators, we have to know our kids. We really have to, we need to change our policies. We need to change our practices. We need to change our focus, but we've got to know those people we work with.
Yeah, absolutely, Scott. And Barack Obama wrote this piece this week where he really called out the fact that the protests are fine and they're necessary. What we got to do is get action. And I wonder how many of our schools are willing to trust that if they put a notion of advocacy, not just advocacy on behalf of kids, but allowing kids to be advocates on behalf of the future, that
Yes.
could we allow them to take leadership and propose legislation to overcome some of the inequities? And that legislation might be in school rules. I
Hmm.
hate saying that some of the inequities start when we discriminate and distinguish, particularly Black boys, from other members of a school community based on the behaviors they're exhibiting created by interpretations of teachers, which might be based on privilege that they come from and not understanding and knowing those children, as you just described earlier. I
Hmm.
think we have work to do at the school level, and I'd look at all of our policies now and say, where do we contribute to that? And the assumptions we make about access to resources and power
Yes.
in anything we do, and including that we schedule a parent night as opposed to maybe where parents in certain suburbs that come to that school might be conveniently able to show up. So we make
Hmm.
assumptions they don't care, but we're 6 kilometers and 2 bus rides away from that parent's neighborhood, and all the way to the legislation in your state or in the country that could be exaggerating issues. And if fundamental health care isn't provided, as it's not in the United States and elsewhere, if fundamental civil rights can't be guaranteed, which includes affordable housing, I think our kids could get really excited about belonging in a place that was really trying to do something about it, not facilitating protest, but facilitating change and understanding the system. Because if it doesn't happen in the legislative system, the current power structure doubles down and creates more rules or just rolls tanks down the street.
Hmm. Exactly. Exactly. I mean, I think you're pointing to the students as the answer. It's entirely correct. We I think we've proven as adults. I mean, that we've blown it. Our generation has blown it, and it's like the environment. We we there's a lot of well-meaning people of all ages when it comes to the environment, when it comes to racial issues, when it comes to how the countries have dealt with this pandemic. There are a lot of well-meaning people out there, but quite honestly, the adults in the room have blown it. And we need to have faith in the next generation, and we need to empower them and entrust them. And schools. Dewey talked about schools being these small democracies in action, and that's where we train the next generation of leaders, and that's exactly what we have to do.
I was watching a video by the quarterback of the New Orleans Saints, who is one of the leading quarterbacks in the United States Gridiron League, as many will
Mm-hmm.
know, a really good guy, a moral leader, and a wonderful person. But he was out there talking about the potential that as the league might start this autumn in the US, spring in Australia, that players might kneel down during the national anthem. And I don't know if you got to see the tape of this, Scott, yesterday,
Yes.
but
Yes.
he's been blown up on social media and in other formats because he was very insensitive, saying that the kneeling down disrespects the flag, and certainly justifiably understood that his grandfathers fought in World War II. But one of his own wide receivers has pushed back, who's one of his brothers in arms in the gridiron battle for victory over whoever they're playing,
Mm-hmm.
and said that just you don't understand, that is your privilege showing, because his grandfathers fought in the war and came back and were disgraced in a country that wouldn't recognize their contributions as African American soldiers. And the current situation isn't about disrespecting the flag or encouraging violence. In fact, it's the opposite of that. It's really about privilege and what happens in a society that doesn't recognize that. And if these things weren't being filmed, they would be ignored, as they
Mm-hmm.
have been now for hundreds of years.
Yes.
And so I think what we've got to do, and I know this podcast may have diverted a little bit from its original intent in some of our listeners' minds, but we're trying to be right on track, is I think our school leadership teams need to focus on what are we doing that's perpetuating the issue. Here's Drew Brees out there looking very foolish, tone deaf to be honest with you, about the issues that are out in society and just shut up or be part of the solution. He's now exaggerated the issue. He's going to have a very difficult time being a leader because he doesn't get it. And I think we're going to have to call out members of our own staff and our own leadership team who really manifest either outwardly bigoted for sure, that's a rare occasion, but these perpetuating these structures and systems that personify privilege and actually hurt and punish anyone who's different, particularly those who are Black and brown. So I would call upon our leaders to really investigate the school rules, the policies, the procedures, the culture, investigate how students can join the conversation because they're going to demand it, and really take some of that space that we have in the curriculum that's been freed up to engage, even in math, even in physics, a whole school conversation about how we become this morally right place in just society, not just study it in utopian literature in isolation. We have to do this. And I think part of Will getting through this, we thought it would be a pandemic. We're going to have to get through some real injustices along that the pandemic is maybe personified.
I think this is a great challenge. And I love the idea of taking the way that schools run and actually having your students break it down, have your students actually try to analyze why things are the way they are in your school, your policies, get your teachers involved in the mix, and have the real conversation about how can we change the status quo so that we actually can, create a more just future for everybody.
Yeah. And in one of our SEM 2 classes that we're about ready to launch in a few weeks, I think that tweak to that assessment that's really on that target about providing that vision for the school, the plan that we ask people to do, the presentation, we need to add that component. And for those listeners who work in higher education, you might modify your assessment to really ask people to confront this if it's possible. We know some people in situations that could put their job on the line, but the whole planet's on the line right now. So I think we got to be a little riskier as long as we're not accusing people. We're actually just trying to build this better, just society. So we should look at our own assessment tasks for the semester ahead and make that modification. Your idea you just shared was great.
John, I've appreciated this conversation. Enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's great to be with you again, Scott, and we thank everybody for listening in.